So welcome to our day 3 of our Communications and Vaccine Demand Generation Workshop. And today we're focusing in on equity, gender, and cultural diversity. Hello to my colleagues online. You're gonna have some online presentations again today because we have Roberto, who's been online for the whole 2 days before and today with us, and he's gonna be a big part of the presentations today, along with Tatiana, who has been in the room with us. So handing over to Tatiana. Tatiana will lead, and then Roberto will follow. Thank you. You can make her feel welcome as she comes up.
Thank you, Lisa. No, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I think that you already know, my name is Tatiana Santos, and I am part of the office team for Equity, Gender, and Cultural Diversity Office of PAHO. In this team, I work specifically in the project that provides access to COVID-19 vaccine to the population situations of vulnerability. And in this project, I am the focal point for the Caribbean region. That it's a pleasure for me. Our team is under the leadership of Jessie Sochan. I suppose that most of you maybe already know her, because before moving to EGC office, she was working here in CRB office as program coordinator for the region of the Caribbean. As you know, today is our last day, and I am already missing you, huh? Believe me, because during these 3 days that we was working together, I learned a lot from all of you, and it was a great opportunity for me to see how rich and culturally diverse is the region, but also to hear some of the challenges that you are facing every day in your work, day by day. With no doubt, all things that we are hearing from you, it will be very, very useful for us as a GC team to continue improving our technical cooperation for this region. No? As you know, as Lisa said, tomorrow is our session, is a session dedicated to EGC office. And our proposal today is share with you some guidelines and recommendations on how we can to include equity, gender, and cultural diversity approach to develop communication materials that be gender sensitive and culturally adapted. For that, initially, we will have a brief welcome of Roberto, that is my coordinator. And after that, you will have a presentation of our colleague from WHO, Kadidi, now I need to, to read. Kadidi, let me know, Kadidia Tuturi, that's our colleague from WHO, in the team of gender equity and human rights. She will present us the guidelines for gender responsive communications. And after a brief moment for questions and answers, Roberto will come back to present us an overview about EGC office, where we are, when we are working, how we are working, and how we can support you in your job related to EGC considerations. And next, Roberto will present also a brief introduction on the knowledge dialogue methodology. That is a skill that could help you to develop the intercultural dialogue with the communities in the context of work, etc. And finally, we have a session for a session for a work group, and the objective of this session is to listen to you how we are considering the implementation of the equity, gender, and cultural diversity in your policies, programs, plans, and actions. But also identify how we can support you in these matters in your countries, okay? But before the official agenda, I will request your permission for share with you a song, a Brazilian song that I love, this song. And I think that fits very, very well in this moment because this song talks about how important is say good morning. Say good morning and receive good morning. And it was very, very important for me here because all time, all place that I go, the people say morning, morning, morning. And the music talk how is powerful, this action. Because sometimes we wake up, we are not very, very good, we are in a bad vibe, a bad mood. But when I hear a warm morning, it can change all the situation. The bad vibes goes away. And I would like your permission and at the same time to invite you to stand up. To stand up, to enjoy the music. I think that you will like it. Greet your colleague in your table, but also the colleague in the other table, because I am sure, could be the last time, the last opportunity before the end of the workshop. And many of you stay all time with the same people. You don't have the opportunity to say hello, to embrace someone, to give, to shake the hands, you know. That I think that's a good opportunity now. And I will ask my colleague to share the music and enjoy it. I would love to hear from you, Bom Dia, because the name of the music is Bom Dia. It means good morning in Portuguese, you know. Huh? Oh? You don't like dance? Then I feel nice and more comfortable because now I am the Brazilian vibe. I think that I can speak English very, very better. And in this Brazilian mood, in this good vibe, I want to pass for my coordinator, Roberto Garza. Bom dia. Welcome.
Thank you, Tati. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Great, thank you. I should say that I have not seen Tatiana happy in the last couple of days. She has been working so hard and you know, putting a lot of effort on this workshop. So it's nice to see these positive vibes, especially right in the morning. So thank you everyone again. And without further ado, I want to introduce all of you to Kadi, who, as Tatiana already said, she is the program manager for the Gender Equity and Human Rights team within the World Health Organization. She will be presenting on gender responsive communications. Thank you, Kadi. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you so much, Tatiana. I must say, I'm now thoroughly jealous that I wasn't in the room dancing or hugging anyone, but I will try my best. As both Roberto and Tatiana have said, my name is Kadi Touré. I am a program manager in the Gender Equity and Rights team. And I'm pleased to present the recommendations that we developed earlier this year on around ensuring the WHO communications, and that is all WHO communications ranging from emails to documents to visuals to programs are gender responsive. I just want to share my screen so that you can see my presentation, and I'm going to ask if you can see it. Well, so thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to start with just the objectives and what we were really trying to do with this recommendations document. It's really to ensure that the communications products that we developed at WHO and in all of the regional offices act as transformative force for gender equality. As we know, the way we communicate can obviously either reinforce gender norms or they can subvert gender norms. And so it was very critical and important for us that we take a deliberate approach at ensuring that we really look at the way that we use our language. The document also just helps us provide an opportunity to enhance awareness among WHO staff on what it means to communicate in a gender responsive and an inclusive way. We did this because we received a lot of asks and demand from colleagues in the different WHO offices saying that they needed guidance around this. And then finally, it was to support WHO staff at all three levels of the organization to create communications which actively tackle gender stereotypes. So you'll see a bit of an insistence in the document around making sure that we're not using any harmful messaging and that we ourselves aren't proponents of harmful gender stereotypes. So the document is developed it's an internal recommendations document. So it's not yet for public use. And we mean for it to be used by WHO staff in both country and regional offices, as well as in HQ, who are producing communications content and who are producing communications interventions, both internally and externally. And I know that sounds like it's a specialized group of people, but actually we are all communicators in our day-to-day through emails, through calls. We all use communications every day. We do hope that this influences the way that we work with our partners. So while it's not an external resource, we hope that you use this in the programs that you run with partners as well, so that those align with the way in which we want to be seen to do business inside the organization. Now, I wanted to provide some background on what is gender, for one, and why it's important. And so gender refers to socially constructed norms that impose and determine power roles and relations between men, women, boys, girls, gender diverse people, and that includes people with non-binary gender identities. So, moving beyond just men and women here. And obviously these norms and relations, they change, they vary from society to society, from country to country. They evolve over time. So what was appropriate 100 years ago isn't necessarily appropriate today. What's appropriate today may not be appropriate or deemed appropriate in 100 years. And really, these social constructs operate at various levels. They help form individual values and identities. So who people think they can be, depending on what society says that they can do, based on who you can be, that helps determine and shape interpersonal relationships. So what kind of behavior a man can have towards a woman, a gender diverse person can have towards a man or a woman. It really starts to shape those interpersonal relationships. And then at a larger scale, it ends up influencing how society is organized writ large. And you see it you see it every day in the jobs that are deemed appropriate for different genders to have, in the roles that they are able to have, in the behaviors that they are able to have without being, judged for stemming outside of or for being outside of their prescribed role. And because these, norms, these roles, these relationships and stereotypes, because they define who you can be, where you can go, how much access you have to education, how much access you have to resources like money, they also can determine whether you can see a doctor, and they will ultimately determine your health outcomes. And so why gender is important is it influences your vulnerability to disease and ill health. If your gender is perceived to be one that should not be exercising, it puts you at increased risk because of that. For instance, we see in some countries where masculinities are associated with high risk behavior, and so it puts you at increased exposure to certain risk factors. It will determine your health literacy because it determines how much access you have to education, how much access you have to health centers, and then ultimately it will define your access to and use of services, because you may need to seek permission to access health services. You might need financial resources to access health services. And so that's all defined by gender. So addressing this through our communications becomes an extremely important part of the work that we do. And so when we ask ourselves, what are gender responsive communications? They're really communications that acknowledge this issue, that understand and that analyze gender norms, roles, and relations, and that ultimately understand the root causes of gender inequality and that take actions to reduce their harmful effects. So it becomes communications products, actions, strategies, plans that really understand that people are different and that builds those differences in the way that we communicate. And so again, why is gender responsive communications important? Is because communications is extremely important in shaping health outcomes, right? We can either advance or subvert gender equality through the way that we talk about things. It's an important skill for everyone to have working in the field of public health, in the field of development, and in the field of humanitarian issues. It's something that we do every day on a day-to-day. And so it's important that we know how to structure our communications in an effective way. Communicating for gender responsiveness or for gender equality is important just because gender equality is a human right. And we, as WHO, are bound to help advance that as a goal. And in addition to being a human right, it makes sense for our programs. Supporting gender responsive healthcare delivery makes sure that you have better health outcomes for all. And we know that the general program of work 13 actually has as part of its major goal an attempt to improve health for all. And that means that we need to structure programs that actually speak to everyone. So what does it mean? So we say gender responsive communications. What does that mean? I'm going to go through over in the next couple of slides what some of the key considerations are for gender responsive communications that you want to build into, one, your products, but then two, also your systems that help you structure your communications products. So you want to ensure meaningful participation. As you develop your products or as you're even setting up task teams, project teams, activity teams that think about communications products, you want to make sure that you are building in representation that is as diverse as possible from a gender perspective. You want to have, men, women, boys, girls, gender diverse people around the table. in a way that really also meaningfully brings their perspectives to the table. It's not only enough to have them in numbers, it's also important to listen to their perspectives. You want to include diverse populations in the development and testing and review of your communications products. So in addition to having a diversity of people within your project teams, as you roll out documents, products that need to be field tested, it's important that you look at all aspects of the population and make sure that they're tested for all aspects of the population. And if you don't do that, what you risk doing is, for instance, we know that clinical trials right now don't have as many women as they do men. They don't have as many ethnic minorities as they do majorities. And so you end up having product development or plan development that only really speak to one group of people, and you leave certain people aside. So you want to ensure meaningful participation as you're developing your products. And that includes things that we don't think about. So if you're developing campaigns, public-facing campaigns, social media campaigns, you want to have influencers that speak to everyone, including populations experiencing marginalization. And what we tend to do is talk to influencers that speak to the broader numbers, but sometimes it's about identifying the people who speak best to smaller groups of people as well. A second thing that you want to do is ensure balanced and equal visibility. So the first consideration that we talked about is in your planning, in your testing, what are you doing? But then in your outwards product, who's being seen and what roles are they being seen in? It would be interesting actually if you're not online. If not, I would have asked you to write in the chat, but maybe just write down on a piece of paper in front of you, and you can exchange within the group where you see preferential visibility in documents. And we see this all the time. You'll see men more present than women in some of our communications. You'll see men, when they are present, have certain roles, be portrayed as doctors, whereas women are portrayed as nurses, or they'll be portrayed in sort of power positions. And you won't see that in women or gender diverse people. So it's about making sure that everyone is seen, and that everyone is seen in empowered positions. So you want to have balanced and equal visibility for men, women, and gender diverse people. And quite frankly, you want to reflect that women make up 70% of the health workforce. So if you're depicting a health setting, it's not even equal and balanced visibility for both. Women actually account for a majority there, and that's often not reflected. You want to include, when you have quotes, when you reference people, you want to include perspectives of women in leadership positions in the health sector. We know that despite the 70% that they account for, women only account for 25% of leadership positions. So it requires taking an extra step forward to seek out their opinions so that their perspectives and perceptions of women in leadership become normalized. And again, you want to show women and gender diverse people in a diversity of positions within the health sector. They're generally not seen as hospital managers, they're not seen as doctors, they're not seen as admin staff. They're very much stereotyped into a specific role. So you want to promote balanced and equal visibility there. Countering stereotypes is a large part of what we want to do with the work that we do. And so sometimes, and this might be counterintuitive, it's about countering what we expect to see. And it's portraying men, women, gender diverse people who challenge typical gender roles. We were looking at a campaign this morning that had a woman in West Africa in traditional garb, on a quad, because that's the means of transport that she was using to do her rounds. And those kinds of pictures really start to shift the way in which we understand what stereotypes are. The more we see things in ways that challenge our norms, the more we understand that sometimes those norms are actually stereotypes. So you really need to question and check that your content doesn't reproduce typical gender roles, typical imagery and colors. For instance, this isn't valid in all cultures, but in Western Europe, at least, and in America, there's a strong association of colors like pink to girls and blue to boys, and making sure that we don't reproduce those in the work that we do. We have a tendency to define a certain type of family setting and a certain type of working practices, you know, women who are doing housework, a nuclear family that has a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. And that often doesn't reflect people's realities in terms of the ways that families are being set up. So just making sure that all of the work that you do actually responds to an active question about whether you're contributing to advancing stereotypes. Promoting diversity and marginalized voices. And this is the point about intersectionality. It's not enough to have men, women, gender diverse people in the communications products that we develop. It's also about understanding that the intricacies and linkages between people's different identities make people from the same gender have very different experiences. So if you are a young Black trans woman in the US from a heavily populated city that has a low level of education, you're going to have a different experience from an older Black woman from a high income setting that you know is a doctor, that's going to have a different experience from an even older woman who's an immigrant who you know is heterosexual and speak English, or understanding that the different aspects of your person will generate extremely different experiences for you beyond just your gender. So the communications products that we develop, programs that we develop, really need to take a look at intersecting barriers and how they impact and have an influence on the way in which people access services. So don't assume sameness with people, even within the same gender, because it's not true. Be mindful that our communications products are diverse in gender, but are also diverse in ethnicity, in race, in ability/disability, in age, in a variety of other categories. And make sure that you're actively making an effort to prioritize and promote voices that you don't often hear. So put those at the forefront. Embracing gender diversity is extremely important. We have had a tendency as an organization and as a world probably to be very binary in our approach. Right? It's women and men and girls and boys. And we are encouraging a movement towards more inclusivity, in recognizing sort of gender diverse people. And that means that in your communications content, you want to stated as such. If you are using short form of language, you just want to use generic language like people. And if you're using long form and can specify, you can say women, men, and gender diverse people, or women and people who menstruate, or just using, but actively defining the different groups that could be affected by whatever disease category you're talking about. Using gender responsive language. I'm not gonna focus on this because there are a couple of slides dealing with this later on, and so you'll get a bit in-depth view on this, but it's about, so the languages that we operate in, be they semi-neutral like English, or be they very gendered like the Latin languages, French, Spanish, and others, have masculine roots to a lot of terms that we deem to be neutral, like man-made, mankind, spokesman, policeman, just their range of terms that are deemed neutral, but their root is in is male. And there are actual studies that show that those perceived neutral terms, because they're not neutral, actually normalize the male perception behind those and have direct impacts on what can be achieved. So if you have a title for a position that is a male title for a position, for instance, women are less likely to apply to that position, even though the term is deemed neutral. But because the sort of root of that term is male, that the association, the implicit unknown association, has actual impacts on outcomes. So it's extremely important to look at the way that we use the language. And I'll come back to this, so I don't want to stay on here too long. And then just the last point is really about empowering and connecting. So using the communications products that you do as an avenue to make a case for gender equality. So make sure that you're empowering women, gender diverse people in just, and any other groups experiencing marginalization in the way that you communicate about them, but also include statistics about gender inequalities and other inequalities. Avoid portraying those groups as inherently vulnerable, and ensure that you're communicating about them as part of the solution. But it's really about giving that context, making sure that you're building in that analysis, so that people understand what the issue is linked to gender inequality. WHO has developed a GRASS scale. It's a gender responsiveness assessment scale. And that scale helps identify whether the programs that we're working on are gender responsive, or whether they're gender unequal, or whether they're actually gender transformative. So we have a scale of 5 levels where you can go from either programs that reinforce stereotypes and perpetuate inequalities. Those are gender unequal programs, to programs that are gender blind. They just act like gender doesn't matter, and so ignore its impact completely on the health outcomes. And those are the gender blind programs, to gender sensitive, where they know, they're aware of gender inequalities and the norms that perpetuate those inequalities, but they don't really do anything about them. To gender specific, where you have targeted action that is linked to men, to women, to gender diverse people, because it recognizes the difference in barriers that they face. To gender transformative, which are programs that themselves try to transform these gender norms and these roles. So I just want to, and you're out loud, so you can't comment in the chat, but you can scream in the room and I can hear you. So I just wanted to put this up. This is a campaign that was run by one of our partners, encouraging people to stay home for COVID-19. If you were to look at this just cold, where do you think this sits on that GRASS scale? So is this an example of a gender unequal? Is it gender transformative? What kind of image are you seeing here? What are you seeing in terms of gender for this image?
Actually, Tatiana can pass on the microphone if a participant wants to.
Yeah, Tatiana,
Yes.
could you see if anyone wants to comment?
Right. I was just saying, good morning, everybody. It is hugely stereotypical. I mean, a man appears only once in that frame. I mean, and he's chilling when he's in the frame, you know? Yeah, hugely problematic.
Okay. That is exactly right. It's stereotypical in so many ways. Again, the man appears once.
Anyone else?
Oop.
It's consensus.
It's consensus?
Yes.
Brilliant. Well, that's exactly that. It's the woman this is reinforcing the woman's caretaker role. It implies that all she does in the house is take care of the house, take care of the kids, to clean. There's no projection of her, working. She could be in front of a laptop. The man could be cleaning. There are just so many issues here. But this is an actual campaign, guys. So this is a campaign but that again continues to reproduce these gender stereotypes. And this is where we're trying to move away from. So on this slide, and maybe I'll just glaze over this, it just has examples of campaigns that are gender unequal, gender specific. But I'll skip over this, and we'll make sure that you have the slide deck, because it can be quite useful for you. Now, beyond just the images and the documents that we produce, there's generally a project cycle that you set in place when you're developing either, your communications plans or products, or your programs writ large. And that communication, project cycle has a number of different steps, and you want to build in gender responsiveness in all of those steps. It's not about just ignoring these steps and just focusing on the end product. If a project cycle starts with an assessment, what you want to do is conduct an intersectional gender analysis before developing the communications products that you want to focus on. And that means having access to disaggregated data. If you don't have access to reports with that systematic disaggregated data, it's about looking for reports, sometimes from civil society organizations, sometimes from partners, where they really allow you to understand what are the gendered issues related to whatever program you're working on, and how can you those need to be factored in the work that you're doing. Once you get through your assessment, you go to the planning stage. And in that planning stage, you want to build in a group of diverse people that can help you think about the proposed actions and solutions. Sometimes we presume knowledge about things that we don't have the best knowledge of. So make sure that you're bringing in the communities that you are targeting to help you think about how to respond to some of those barriers that you've identified through that assessment. In the implementation as well, you want to bring those groups on. And we talked about earlier bringing on, relevant influencers. It's just making sure that the plan is being rolled out through channels, through using messages, and through programs that are really speaking to the people that you're targeting. And then finally, from a monitoring and evaluation perspective, it's about collecting data that's disaggregated as much as possible. So even if you're collecting feedback on your comms campaigns, and it's about using gender sensitive and gender specific indicators where there is a possibility to do that. And that your reporting teams and your data collection teams, again, have some gender balance so that there's more reflection about some of these issues. And that you build this in when you report out. What we're seeing, at least at our level, is that a number of donors have gotten very interested in this question and actually want to systematically see some report on how we're integrating this. Canada, for instance, is one that's given us some resources at HQ and expects us to talk about what we're doing specifically to address gender equity and human rights. And given that that's part of our mandate for the GPW 13, it makes sense that even in the reporting, we start to talk about what we've done to address this problem. So that's on the project cycle writ large. I mentioned that I'd come back to this question of gender inclusive language, right? And so what that means is you speaking and writing in a way that doesn't discriminate against a particular sex or gender identity, or doesn't, perpetuate gender stereotypes. So we started talking about this earlier on, and it's the mankind's, it's the man-made, the mother tongue, the gentleman's agreements, the manpower. And we see that in a lot of instances, those words have started being replaced. Staff is being used more often than manpower. Personnel is being used more often than manpower. Parental leave is now being used. Native language as opposed to mother tongue. We are seeing ourselves.
Sorry, Kadi.
Oh, yes, please.
But it's not possible to read the sentences.
Oh, you can't? Can you see my screen?
You can see the screen, but the letters are white. Is that blurry?
The
So
letters are
the
blurry.
words that are in the red and green boxes are hard for us to read. So if you could read what are in those
Oh,
boxes?
yes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. So for instance, in the red box at the top left, it says mankind, which is the, the word that would have traditionally been used. And then we provide options for how you can substitute those. For instance, humanity, human beings, people. There are a lot of words that don't have man as the root. Man-made as well is in the box under that can be substituted by artificial. The box under that is mother tongue, which is currently being substituted in a number of areas by native language. Next to that, you have manpower, and that's being replaced by staff, by personnel, by human resources. There are just a number of words for that. So there, and in the document, and we'll make sure that you have the link to the document as well as the short brief, you have tables that give you examples of these. And because it's oftentimes just it's just common language, so it's a reflex to use that the male rooted word as opposed to using the more neutral language. And again, I do want to insist that there is evidence and research on gender fair language. That's what they call these gender neutral terms, on gender fair language, that shows that it actually has an impact on imaging and projection and people's opportunities relatedly. And so a second part of gender inclusive language is the way in which we portray people and their roles, right? So one, in this red box here, you have John and Samira have full-time jobs, and he helps her with the housework. Whereas what that might read is John and Samira have full-time jobs, they share the housework. And the difference between the first sentence and the second sentence is the first sentence presumes that housework is Samira's job and that John is just helping. So being sure that even in sentences like that, that seem relatively inoffensive, that you're aware of where you're building in stereotypes. And so the second box says, doctors usually have little time for their wives and children. Tatiana, do you want to ask someone in the audience what the problem is with that sentence? Since they can't see the screen, it's a good exercise.
Okay.
So the sentence reads, doctors usually have little time for their wives and children. What is the problem there?
Okay, we have some.
Do we have a volunteer?
That the doctor is that doctors are males. Are
Exactly.
men.
That's exactly what the problem is. So it's so that's essentially where we're trying to get to in terms of using gender inclusive language, is making sure that the way we write builds out stereotypes. It starts to have them leave. The last part of this sort of inclusive language bit is around personal pronouns. And we use pronouns as a way of communicating a lot, right? Because one of the questions that we get is sort of why the focus on pronouns? Why is it important? But it's in the language that we use. It is built in relatively often. We refer to people as either, Dr. X or Mrs. X or Mr. X, or we'll say he did this and she did that and they went over there. And so it's something that happens very often. But what we're encouraging is that you use a person's desired pronoun as a form of mutual respect and courtesy. And so, whereas we have a tendency to just say he, she, there's a recommendation that we can use pronouns like they in the English language at least is a neutral pronoun that can be applied to he, she, or someone that doesn't fall within those two genders or doesn't want to assign themselves a gender in that communication. And there's also the use of zehir or zezir right now to denote gender diverse populations. And so we are recommending that this be done. There's also extensive research on gender diverse populations, particularly trans populations, and the mental health effects of being systematically marginalized or misrepresented and misnamed. And that partially comes from a refusal to accept the third gender, if one could call it that, or genders that aren't specifically male or female. And so that's why that's being encouraged. Obviously, this is something that happens either in your ways that you can encourage that, or just by asking people what they would like to be called. Or by putting it in your signature yourself. Like, for instance, if you have in your signature he, she, then the person speaking to you will refer to you as he, she, zir, or they. And at least it sort of puts them at ease to share their pronouns. And this is also valid, I say to people, because people ask, why this is important, and they think it's just a sort of gender thing, but for me it's actually also a culture thing. So my name is Khadijatou Touré. I'm from Senegal, West Africa, and no one knows what that is. So I'm Mr. 80% of the time. It's like people write emails to me and I'm always Mr. And so it is just a sort of common courtesy and a question of really trying to identify what people identify as, because if people ask me, I identify as a she. I don't mind. But so it's about providing people with that common courtesy that allows them to self-identify.
Thank you again. And so for today, as Tatiana had said during the morning, we were having first this component of these guidelines for gender responsive communications. Now we are going to be going briefly through some main components of what equity, gender, and culturally diversity means. We will talk about one specific tool that might help you out in your communication efforts, the intercultural dialogues. And then finally, we will have a small work group session. So Kadi has already presented this guideline. And now we wanted to talk a little bit about the health equity concept. So we wanted first to share this set of images just to kind of like go back to the beginning of the pandemic. Many of you might remember that once everything started, in my case, I was actually working in the front line as a COVID-19 responder locally in the US. So you might remember that at the beginning around the world, there was this specific focus on long-term care facilities, for example, nursing homes. So most of the attention and prioritization was given to those congregated settings, plus individuals with underlying health conditions. But what I wanted to point out is that you can see on the right how rapidly the virus demonstrated some of the inequities that our societies face. You can see people cleaning the streets. You can see people selling food on the streets, people cleaning the public transportation systems. You can see indigenous communities and young people. So COVID-19 has demonstrated that even though there are specific groups of population that are a priority because of, again, either underlying health conditions, comorbidities, at the same time, the position that people have in society can put them at a higher risk of vulnerability to COVID-19. So, and some of the key facts that we have seen during the pandemic related to gender is that all of you might know that women are the main caregivers in most of our societies. Unfortunately, most of the time that's unpaid work. But at the same time, for example, when you look at people with different abilities or people with disabilities, most of the expenses that were dedicated to provide therapeutic services and educational support to them were cut off because of the COVID-19 response, and particularly those tasks additionally were falling into women. The other big thing that we have seen during COVID related to gender is that the confinement and restrictive measures like isolation protocols, quarantine protocols, for example, have created these isolating conditions for family groups. And that can become, as it says here on the blue square, the perfect storm, as women and girls are more at risk if they remain at home with their abusers. There has been an increase in the cases of reported violence against women. As you can see here, actually, during the first months of the pandemic, hotlines for domestic violence around the world saw an increase of like 30 to 40% in the number of calls. So that's just some examples of how the pandemic has disproportionately affected women. And going back to Cadi's point on this importance of having gender responsive efforts. So how does that translate to COVID-19 vaccination? Here it's a little assessment that we did internally in PAHO to the different national vaccination plans. So what we did is that we looked into all of the available and publicly available plans that Caribbean and Latin American countries had published. So what we wanted to look is how different population groups have been prioritized. As you might remember, during the first day when Dr. Karen Broom was opening up with this great presentation, she was just reinforcing how it's very important to continue focusing on the elderly. You can see on the bottom, so that's fine. We can see how there is a huge priority for essential workers, people with comorbidity and risk factors. But then you start questioning what happens with other population groups that maybe biologically are not at a higher risk, but socially, when you look at the determinants of health, you know that there are specific population groups that might be more affected, not only by COVID-19, but by other communicable diseases. So when you look at rural populations living in overcrowding conditions, migrants, refugees, unhoused or homeless individuals, they were very prioritized. You can see those in color orange. So the thing is, if our ministries of health, if our EPI programs don't actively develop or at least consider these other population groups, they are continue going to be left behind. So how do we support the Office for Equity, Gender, and Cultural Diversity? We tackle or aim to tackle these three main areas of work that hold equity a concept, which is a fundamental component of social justice. We aim for gender equality, and at the same time, we look for intercultural approaches to health. How do we make more inclusive public health interventions? And just as a quick refresher, sometimes even in the day-to-day, we forget about the huge difference about equality and equity. You can see here in this image how equality means, you are giving this little box, the same box to everyone. It doesn't matter how tall you are, but you are supposed to get to the fruits that are hanging from the tree with the same box that everyone was given. When you look on the right, is that you are implementing the equity concept, the equity definition, which means you are looking at people from where they are and you are trying to provide, if needed, additional resources so all of them can reach to the end goal, in this case, getting to where the fruits are hanging. And then in a more comprehensive way, the way we look into health equity is by understanding that there are different structural drivers, political, social, cultural, economic, the environment, the history, colonialism, as we said already, structural racism. All of those are going to have an impact on, as well, the conditions of the daily life of individuals, how much access people have to the early life and early education, how people have access or not to the working life, and so on. And eventually you can see on the top part of this image, that intersectionality. So as Kadi was saying before, we need to look at broader intersections of different aspects that will have an impact ultimately on health outcomes. For example, social and economic inequities, the gender concept that we have been already talking about in the previous presentation, sexuality, ethnicity, disabilities or different abilities, and migration. And then the other concept that we wanted to bring to your attention is how the pandemic has disproportionately impacted different populations and mainly those in situation of vulnerability. We know that specific populations, and we didn't want to name any populations because every single country is different. Every single country is going to have different population groups that experience higher situations of vulnerability and ultimately higher risks. Why? Because we know that specifically with COVID, these population groups might have more difficulties to practice social distancing. They might be more prone to suffering domestic and gender-based violence. Some of them might be at a higher risk of increased mental illness, a violation of fundamental rights, stigmatization, discrimination, and all of that is rooted, as you can see in these different roots of the tree, based on precarious housing. Many people were already living under precarious housing conditions. So when you bring COVID-19 into the equation, this is again a perfect storm. How are people going to be able to properly isolate or quarantine if they don't have the right housing conditions? If they have a lack of, if they have been lacking quality education, quality water, if they don't have access to health services, communication and transportation methods. So at the end of the day, what we need to look into is concepts that can help us if you are coming from an EPI program, if you are coming from a communications program or a health promotion program. There are concepts that can help us out when looking at all of these different population groups that we were referring to, and that is the concept of cultural competence and cultural humility. When you look at the cultural concept here in this pyramid, is being aware of your own worldview. How do you perceive the world? Those are some of the first steps. You need to develop positive attitudes toward cultural difference. We need to be aware that in the middle of globalization, now we have people coming from different backgrounds, from different countries, from different religions. So how can we develop skills for better communication and interaction across cultures? And then when we look on the right into cultural humility, this is a more comprehensive term, which basically looks at three main components. This overall concept of cultural humility was developed by researchers, Melanie Terbalon and John Moray Garcia. They actually have great resources online on YouTube that I invite all of you to look for. And basically they are referring to three key elements, which are a personal lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. What that means is that all of us need to constantly look inside of us. What are our own biases? What are our own perceptions? Because at the end of the day, it can be not only applied to our personal life, but also to our professional life. So we need to have this lifelong commitment to continuously evaluate and critique ourselves and understand more about our own biases that are rooted in our families, in our cultures, in our religions. So we also need to have a recognition of the power dynamics and imbalances. So all of you from your different positions with the MOH and the different programs that you represent, how can you challenge those power dynamics? How can you think about population groups that have been left behind and are continuing to be left behind? Perhaps if you are developing a vaccination campaign, how do you make sure that you are aiming to reach those in harder to reach areas, those that don't have traditionally access to immunization services. And finally, how do you make your institutions accountable? This is the third point, institutional accountability. How can you, from the MOH and from the different programs that you represent, hold yourself accountable to actively include and develop more inclusive strategies to target different population groups? And that's perhaps some of the different things that our office, Equity, Gender, and Cultural Diversity, aims to support with by considering and developing approaches that can be more inclusive for different population groups. And just I wanted to share this quick example from Belize. Actually, our colleagues on site from Belize, you might have met Dr. Petra Arana here on the left. So this project basically was aiming to work with grassroots organizations, NGOs, local organizations that know their context better and that can help the MOH and the EPI programs to actually reach out to those communities, both in harder to reach areas or that have communities that require a more culturally appropriate approach. For example, in this case, they were aiming to work with indigenous communities, Mopan Mayan communities in Belize, and maybe your colleagues from Belize might be able to share a little bit later more about that. And then finally, before we go into a little break, we wanted to share a specific tool that PAHO has been developing and has been piloting and implementing in different countries, mainly as of now in Spanish-speaking contexts in Latin America, but the idea is to make this available for English-speaking context and, of course, for the Caribbean region. So we call it intercultural dialogues, or also they are known as knowledge dialogues. And the reason why we use the term dialogues instead of dialogue is because we are aiming for a continuous process of learning and exchange of best practices among communities. So it's not only one training, one workshop, one session, it's multiple that are built over time. And this is, as I said, a continuous process of communication and exchange of knowledge between individuals and groups that are coming from different origins, cultures, or ways of thinking. It is a horizontal exchange of knowledge. So this has been traditionally a challenge because, for example, the knowledge dialogues, they aim for a horizontal approach, which means the healthcare sector, in this case, let's say, for example, an EPI program, is trying to gather and get together with a specific population group. You can name it, indigenous communities, LGBTIQ plus communities, migrants, refugees, and so on. So what we do is that we aim for an exchange of both sectors that are gathering to share best practices, attitudes, perceptions. So instead of a more traditional approach where you go there and you want them to know more about vaccine safety, or you want them to know more about the overall vaccination process, or you want them to know about isolation or quarantine. What we are aiming for is a little bit different because we want communities to also bring their voices to that table so we can build more inclusive and stronger interventions. This methodology has three main stages or phases, or we refer to them as moments. The first one is about creating the right conditions. So what that means is that we make sure that there is this political will, there is this concurrence, so to make official the work from not only the national level, but more importantly, or the same as important as working with the local level. We need to have that kind of commitment from the authorities to be able to move on. And then what we do is that we build intersectoral teams. So we want people from different backgrounds. within a specific health program. For example, if you are talking about health promotion or the EPI program, we want to have a diverse team within this specific program. Normally, we first facilitate or we support with facilitating a training for facilitators. So it's like a TOT, training of trainers, because the facilitator is one of the most important roles for these intercultural dialogues. We do a stakeholder mappings. So what we do is that we look into the different actors in the communities that can help out to develop a specific public health interventions. And at the same time, what we do when we are creating conditions is that we look into, for example, the gender responsive communications. We look into intercultural approaches. We make sure that, for example, if you are aiming to work with a population group that speaks another language, do you guys have the capacity within your team to talk to them in their own language? Do you need to look into support to get an interpreter or a translator, for instance? So we make sure that all the conditions are in place so we can then go to the second one. The second moment is where we have this dialogue exchange itself. So normally the facilitator, as I said before, is gonna take the lead on making sure that knowledge, information, thoughts can be shared across this team that is gathering. It's normally based on an agreed problem. So when we are in the first moment creating conditions, we want to hear more from communities about what are some of the main problems, issues, or difficulties that they have faced, so that then we can look into how we can bridge those existing gaps or limitations. And what we do is a cause and consequence analysis. So we look heavily into these problems that have been identified from the communities themselves. And what we do is that we carefully try to analyze more about the different causes of those problems and the consequences that they can have. And more importantly, what kind of actions or interventions or efforts we can design and develop to overcome the causes, the root causes of those problems. Finally, we come up with a work plan, with a roadmap, and specific commitments on how to move forward. This is just an example. It's just like a matrix with the one normally we work with the communities. As I said before, normally it's around an identified and perceived problem by the communities. And we try to gather more information about the causes, the consequences, and then we come up together with them with specific actions and interventions that can help to move forward. And finally, in the third moment is that based on the work plan and the roadmap that has been defined, we do a continuous process of monitoring and evaluation. So we aim for continuous quality improvement, and we prepare for the upcoming dialogue sessions. And then we wanted to share a quick example from a community in Peru. So the topic or the issue that they wanted to work on was the limited acceptance of COVID-19 vaccination. So what is really nice in this example is that in Peru, both at the national level and at the regional and local level, there are people already trained on the methodology. So the whole process of intercultural dialogues has been already immersed within the MOH. So now this is a regular activity that they carry on, for example, as part of the EPI work that they do. So in this case, they wanted to work closely with these indigenous communities. The community is called Tutumberos. And what you can see here is some of the main actors that they identified locally that they can work with. So there were NGOs that they wanted to bring to the table. The APU, which for indigenous communities, most of the time refers as the indigenous leader, the person in charge of an indigenous group. They also wanted to bring the local police to this table, the teachers, the faith-based organizations like the pastor or the faith-based leader, And then together, they ended up talking about different problems that their community is facing in terms of the acceptance of the COVID-19 vaccine. And what they do, you can see here that the number 3, the lack of information on the COVID-19 vaccine, this is the one that they ended up voting to be the problem with the one they were going to be working on during the next couple of days. So some of the problems that they were identifying, as you can see, is why do they need to get vaccinated if they have already contracted the virus? How are they supposed to get the COVID-19 vaccine if at that point in time we are talking about 2021, the vaccine was not widely available in Peru, that they thought that the vaccine could be exterminate their indigenous community, the Aguajún people. They said that some people got vaccinated and then they developed poor health. They also said that some of the vaccinators were administering fake vaccines. So it was pretty much a combination of water and air. They were kind of like concerned about why the vaccine is mandatory or could become mandatory. They said that the vaccine is not well manufactured. The vaccines come with the seal of the beast. This has been a perception that has been shared among other indigenous communities. So this has some connection with some information that has been shared online. Maybe some of you guys have heard about that as well. And then overall, there was a mistrust in the vaccination process. So as I said before, as a group, they ended up defining and agreeing on the number 3, the lack of information on the COVID-19 vaccine. So then we move on to the matrix that I was talking to you before. So once they have identified a problem, is that they start working on different activities, work group sessions, and so on, where they are going to be talking more about the causes of the problem. In this case, they were referring to the lack of coordination between the health personnel and their population, their community. They were referring to fake vaccine videos. Also, in terms of causes here, they were also referring to the failure to attend health and community meetings. So what actions can they do to overcome those causes? They were talking about hosting quarterly meetings between the health staff, in this case, EPI program staff and community members. They define a specific timeframes. You can see here, November, August, and who is the person responsible. The health staff plus the APU. As I said before, the APU being the leader from this indigenous community. For fake vaccine videos, they wanted, for instance, that vaccinators could show them the sealed vaccine, the syringe, and the vial, so that they could somehow trust more on the process, and then that it should be done by the health personnel. And then finally, about the failure to attend health and community meetings, they were talking about the importance of socializing, so informing more to their community about the upcoming community meetings, to share more information on vaccination, perhaps in their own language, and to prepare a list with the names of those individuals who are interested in getting the vaccine. At the end of the process, what they come up with is that they have a little roadmap or action plan, and you can see on the right that all of them put their signature. So this is just to kind of like confirm one more time that there is a commitment from both parties, the community and the health personnel, to move on with the agreed actions that have been identified as part of the intercultural dialogues. So I think this is the end of my presentation for now. As I said before, we will have a short break, but before going into the break, I wanted to know if there are any questions, any comments about this part so far. Thank you. Avi. Oh, sorry, you were clapping. I thought you were going to ask a question.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, everyone, and talk to you soon. Thank you.